Good afternoon. I'm Michelle Stringer, Chair of the Board of Trustees here at the museum. And on behalf of my fellow trustees, Max Weintraub, our CEO and President, and the entire staff, I welcome you to our dynamic conversation today. Art in the Nazi Era, Institutions and Restitutions. Today's conversation will delve into the history and scholarship of art restitution, setting light on the complexities and significance of addressing the injustices of the past. Today's moderator, Elaine Mehalakes, is a Vice President of Curatorial Affairs here at the museum. As curator, Elaine has recent projects including reimagining the museum's American galleries and an exhibition centered on the reattributed Rembrandt, which I think many of you saw. Elaine has worked on artist commissions ranging from sound art installations to letterpress poetry broadsides. Her publications include Color and Complexity, the Durham Press, and American Identities, 20th Century Prince and Nancy Gray Sherrill, Class of 1954 collection. Her publications have explored such topics as contemporary drawings, experimental prints, the restitution of cultural artifacts, and the impact of foreign travel on American artists. Before coming to the Allentown Art Museum, Elaine had positions at Davis Museum at Wellesley College, the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and completed her graduate work at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. Elaine, I'll turn it over to you to introduce our distinguished guest here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. I'd like to start by sharing what inspired us to host this conversation today. In July of 2022, the museum received a letter on behalf of the descendants of Henry and Herta Bromberg, who lived in Hamburg, Germany until the late 1930s. They asked us to check the provenance of a painting in our collection, Portrait of George the Bearded, Duke of Saxony, by Lucas Cranach the Elder and Workshop. It's an important painting for several reasons. The artist was one of the most influential of the 16th century, and the painting is very finely painted with crisp detail and immediacy. It also refers to a key moment in social, political, and religious history shortly after the Protestant Reformation, and it portrays Duke George of Saxony, who was opposed to this movement. He wears, let me show you the painting. There we go. He wears a gold chain around his shoulders. As you can see, it displays the Catholic insignia of the Order of the Golden Fleece. So if you look closely, you can see a golden ram hanging from the chain. And his beard flows quite long in this portrait, which was made sometime after 1534, when he had stopped trimming it after the death of his wife. In addition to the historical and art historical significance of the painting, it was also the first major purchase for this museum. I don't think we knew when we received that letter that it would lead to over 2 years of research, not only into the provenance or history of ownership of the Cranach painting, but also into the complex historical, legal, and ethical considerations surrounding an object that had changed hands in Europe during the Nazi era. We'll have a chance to learn more about this in conversation with our speakers today. Henry and Herta Bromberg owned an important collection of old master paintings and decorative art objects, some of which, including the Cranach, had been passed down by Henry's father, Martin. The couple had 4 sons, Harold, Edgar, Gerhard, and Oswald. After the Nazis came to power, Henry and Herta recognized the danger their family was in due to their Jewish identity. And they arranged for their 4 sons to immigrate to America between 1935 and 1938. The couple left Germany themselves in 1938 after paying the exorbitant flight tax levied on Jewish citizens. Traveling through Switzerland and France, the Brombergs sold their remaining works of art, including Portrait of George the Bearded, in order to fund their passage to the United States. In learning this information, the museum had to consider a number of issues. Ownership as it is defined under the law, the museum's obligation as an institution that holds its collection in the public trust, recommendations based on the Washington Principles and the Terezin Declaration, which we'll learn more about later, the recommendations of organizations such as the American Alliance of Museums, the Association of Art Museum Directors, and the International Council of Museums, and the current interpretations of such guidance. Ultimately, the ethical considerations surrounding the specific situation of the Bromberg family were the primary factors in the museum's decision. I'm pleased to say that the museum and the heirs of Henry and Herta Bromberg recently came to an amicable resolution of the question of ownership, which both parties agreed was a fair and just solution. This agreement will result in the deaccessioning or formal removal from the collection and sale of the painting. Christie's will auction the work at their January 2025 Old Master sale in New York. I'm grateful to Museum President and CEO Max Weintraub, Chair of our Board of Trustees Michelle Stringer, Honorary Trustee Dolores Laputka Esquire, and Attorney Nicholas O'Donnell for all of the conversations we had throughout this process. I'm also grateful to Mark Mascalini for his assistance and to the staff, the Collections Committee, and the Board of Trustees for their support. Thank you for being here to engage with the important subject of restitution as it pertains to artworks that changed ownership during the Nazi period in Europe. With our highly knowledgeable speakers, we'll explore some of the varied situations and their contexts, the challenges for institutions seeking to navigate broad recommendations, and the ethical considerations crucial to reaching fair and just solutions. And now I'd like to welcome our speakers. Richard Aronowitz is Global Head of Restitution at Christie's and a member of the United Kingdom Government's Advisory Group on Spoliation Matters. He began his career in the art world as a furniture porter at Bonhams in 1993, then joined Sotheby's as an Impressionist and Modern Art Specialist in 1997, before leaving to become director of the Ben-Uri Gallery in 2003. He rejoined Sotheby's as European Head of Restitution in 2006, then moved to Christie's in March 2022 as Global Head of Restitution. Richard is the author of the novels 5 Amber Beads, It's Just the Beating of My Heart, An American Decade, and Night Comes Down, forthcoming from Guernica Editions in 2025, as well as a book of poetry, Life Lessons. Welcome, Richard. Eileen Brankovic joined Christie's in 2012 after studying law and with extensive auction experience. After 8 years with Impressionist and Modern Art Americas, she moved to Restitution as International Business Director. Ms. Brankovic is responsible for delivering on Christie's restitution mission to ensure that Christie's did not knowingly sell spoliated but unrestituted artworks, to research provenance, expanding scholarship around the history of collecting and the art market, and to provide Christie's services to members of the restitution community. Ms. Brankovic oversees the team of provenance researchers. Located in New York, London, Berlin, Brussels, and Vienna, Christie's team of researchers have over 100 combined years of experience. Christie's has the largest and most experienced restitution team of any international auction house, underscoring its responsibility to this field, making Nazi-era provenance research a hallmark of its expertise and inextricably a part of the art historical framework. Please join me in welcoming Eileen Brankovic.
What we are there chiefly to do, quite apart from the story of the Cranach here, what we're there to do is to try and make sure, as far as we possibly can, that no unrecovered piece of Nazi loot, in its very broadest definition, and perhaps we'll talk a little bit about definition shortly, slips into one of our auction catalogues and auctions. And that's no mean feat with the many, many thousands of lots you can imagine we at Christie's want to sell or do sell every year around the world. Anything before 1945, created before 1945, could, at least theoretically, have been looted or lost or subject to forced sale. So it's a huge task. And so I particularly like the moral, ethical dimension, and that feels tremendously important to us as a team. So yeah, the work found me in my case. I didn't proactively go after it, but it fits perfectly who I am and my biography.
One of the things that struck me in our experience with the Cranach painting and being approached by the Bromberg family was learning about this history in a much more personal way. So one of the things that the family sent to us when they inquired and asked that we check the provenance of the painting was a set of photos that the family had taken in their family home in Hamburg before they left. And that those photos included the artwork on the walls and included this painting. And so it was a very direct contact. And so I wondered if we could talk a little bit about that in terms of your experience, and how does knowing the story of objects like these and their history of ownership, how does that help us get a better understanding of the lived experiences of individuals?
Well, I think to answer the question perhaps with its conclusion, I think I can speak for both of us in saying that one of the greatest privileges of our work isn't only the research that the team of researchers does and the outcome if they find a work that has an unresolved Nazi-era taint still attached to it. It isn't even really the resolution of that taint through a settlement sale, for instance, the process that the Cranach will go through. It's really the retelling of the stories that have often been forgotten and lost. And you'd be amazed, or perhaps not, if you descend maybe from European Jewish families, but you'd be amazed how frequently the current generation of these families don't even know their proper family story. Of course, the Brombergs did, because they have a researcher and a lawyer acting for them, and they're an active claimant family, but so many families that we approach, say they're in their 20s or 30s or 40s now, dispersed throughout the world, they often don't know the detail of their family stories or the details of the collection that their grandmother or grandfather once had. So that's a particular privilege, is being able to tell both the families some of the family narrative that has fallen away in the last 80 or so years, just like mine had for my family. And more than that, being able then to tell the world about these stories through essays in our auction catalogues and through signage in our galleries. And that's, I think, a huge privilege.
I completely agree, and it has been one of the greatest privileges for me too, to be part of shining a light on these lost stories, bringing them back to light, as our sage chairman says, excavating these histories and shining a light on them is a huge responsibility and honor. And I think one of my favorite stories came when I first started in the restitution department. We were entrusted with a beautiful, beautiful Van Gogh drawing called La Mousme. It's a study for a work that's in the National Gallery now and is one of his finest works on paper, and beautifully treated. I'm sure Elaine could talk more about the art historical significance. But when we were entrusted with this picture, we saw in the published provenance when it came to us that it was in the collection of Kurt Hirschland, purchased in the late 20s, and then was with the Hirschland family until it was sold decades later. And we knew the Hirschland family name as one that had been persecuted, and so dug deeper in part of doing our due diligence in preparing this work for sale. And what was extraordinary, working with our researchers, Ariella Braunschweig, who's now with an organization externally, and our director in London, Sarah Doan, combing through hundreds of pages of archival documents from the city of Amsterdam, she uncovered letters between the Hirschland family and the Stedelijk Museum there. And the story then started to flesh out and fill in a way that wasn't expected. On the appearance and on the surface, it didn't look as if there was a problem or wartime story at all. It was the Hirschlands in the 20s and then through the rest of their lives. But what became apparent was that this wonderful drawing was a gift to his wife Henrietta in the late 1920s, and it was hers as a gift from him. And they were persecuted in the early 30s. They were Jewish bankers in Essen and had to leave. They fled and ended up in Amsterdam. And this drawing must have meant something incredible to Henrietta, because she went back to Germany and took this drawing along with a couple of other artworks and brought it back with her to Amsterdam during that period in the 30s before the occupation in the Netherlands. The situation in the Netherlands became increasingly pressured, and she left to Canada and ultimately to New York, and entrusted this drawing with a business associate. He too was Jewish and also came under increasing pressure and left it with a neighbor. And it was from the neighbor's apartment that the picture disappeared. And again, looking through these letters and why provenance research is so important and why it can retell a history, parts of history that hadn't been widely known. What we found was that it was entrusted with the neighbor. Her son was in a forced labor camp. She was then imprisoned, and he was able to come back, and he found this picture in the apartment. And to survive, ended up trading it, which is how it ended up through hands and with the museum, ultimately. But it tells a story of survival, of movement, of diaspora, of exile, and discovery and tenacity, because Mrs. Hirschland, after the war, didn't give up. She searched and searched for the artwork that she left behind. And in a chance encounter, it was discovered by a family associate, and through incredible persuasive skills, she was able to have it restituted back to her from the Stedelijk Museum in the mid-1950s. And that whole story hadn't ever been published before it came up for sale. And in the course of doing our due diligence, our wonderful researchers saw a thread and pulled on it until it could bring back to light this important story that, again, tells a tale of what people went through at that time, which was horrific.
Really incredible to learn through these objects, these very poignant stories of people's experiences. So we've been talking a lot about restitution, so maybe we should pause a moment and define that word. What does it mean to restitute something, and what are we talking about when we say we want to come to a fair and just solution?
The two terms, can we go to the start of the Washington Principles slide? Do we have the... Oh, there we are, perfect. The two terms, restitution and settlement, are obviously very much interlinked. But what we do, before I get on to the definition of settlement, what we do in the commercial art world, just as what you've done in the museum context is very much framed within these 11 Washington Principles. I don't know if you as an audience can see them properly. Number 1 says that art that had been confiscated by the Nazis and not subsequently restituted should be identified, which is the process that began when this museum was contacted by the Bromberg heirs and their lawyer. Number 3 is resources and personnel should be made available to facilitate the identification of all art that had been confiscated by the Nazis and not subsequently restituted. So clause 3 of the Washington Principles gives you, I hope, very much a clear understanding of why an auction house like Christie's has a restitution team. And it's worth perhaps reminding you that before 1998, before the Washington Conference on Holocaust era assets happened, auction houses didn't have people like Eileen and I and our team working in them. And in fact, this whole topic was one that was hardly thought about. So when I joined the commercial art world, much like Eileen, I'm sure, this sort of practice of restitution department specialists and provenance researchers simply didn't exist. Me as a scholar of German language and art history and being of a German Jewish, Polish Jewish family, used to look at old auction catalogues from Christie's, Sotheby's, Bonhams, Phillips, and regional German and French auction houses particularly. This was in the sort of mid to later 1990s. And I used to sit there in the Impressionist and Modern Art Library, agog at all the obviously Jewish surnames printed in the auction catalogues for lots that had been sold in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and early 90s. I can broadly say that no one thought about them at all. No one thought about who these human beings were, what had happened to them, perhaps, if they were in a country that became Nazified, and what had happened to the artwork that we or Sotheby's or Bonhams or Phillips had been printing in these catalogues and selling. It wasn't until that landmark event that the entire landscape was reshaped. And it wasn't so much the Washington Conference itself, which happened at the end in late November, early December 1998 at the US Holocaust Memorial Museum and at the State Department. It wasn't so much that was the huge achievement and seismic shift, it was those principles, because it suddenly gave descendants of Jewish families who had lost cultural assets, artifacts, a means to recover them. Because, of course, the passage of time meant, by the late 1990s, that almost all legal remedies had dissolved because of statutes of limitations and latches here, I think in the US, one would call it. So the legal possibilities had generally fallen away because of the passage of time. But the moral ethical force of these principles allowed descendants of families who had lost things to start making claims again. So our world, and the museum world, woke up to a new dawn where suddenly restitution claims were possible. And both major auction houses established restitution departments to do provenance research. Of course, we're different from a museum because we don't own the objects that we research or restitute in the broader sense. We are simply custodians of them as they come from our consignors to our buyers. We are the conveyors of title. So when we talk about restitution, what we really mean usually is settlement sales. So if we discover a problem with the work of one of our wonderful researchers, that problem needs to be addressed, usually through a process of mediation between our consignor, the would-be seller, and a set of claimants, such as the Bromberg heirs. And the remedy is nearly always a financial one. So the object, more often than not, still proceeds into a sale, but it proceeds into a sale with a settlement clause in place, allowing title to pass to our buyer, and a share of the sale proceeds will go to the claimant family in full and final resolution of their claim. So we're not restituting the object. We're allowing a settlement to take place, which is a financial settlement, giving good title to the new owner, our buyer, and settling the many decades old unresolved Nazi-era taint. So we're not really restitutors, we're more orchestrators of financial settlements addressing a history that had long lain unresolved. Your situation is a bit different because you're a museum that essentially is the owner of objects. So the paradigms are different. Although in this case of the Cranach, the solution is actually the same.
I think you've captured that exactly right and well. And I'd add only that the situation that we find ourselves in is mediating conversation often between what one might say is two innocents. You have people who were persecuted decades and decades ago, or their heirs and their family members, and then oftentimes a good faith owner who had no knowledge of this history. If I can, I'll stress again how difficult it is to really excavate those histories. So being able to marry up the past of these objects with the present, and then being able to find solutions to find some historic justice, and something that takes into account the position of the current holder as well as the heirs of those who have been persecuted is a tremendous responsibility and honor that we're able to be a part of. And the Christie's team that's been working on restitution claims for decades now are pleased to have been honored to have been a part of helping find over 300 solutions over time. So as a marketplace, we're in a position as a filter where we can find and pick up these issues, and it's our responsibility to do so. And so we're pleased to do that and to work with the museum in this situation.
I think you heard a phrase earlier, if I remember rightly, in the introduction, just and fair. It's worth pointing out that just and fair is the provision within Clause 8 of the Washington Principles that really, as woolly as it might appear to any of you in the room, particularly who are lawyers, just to fair, just to whom, fair to whom, what do they exactly mean? But the just and fair provision of Clause 8 of the Washington Principles really, I think, encourages us, allows us to do the quiet mediation between our consignor and a set of claimants to achieve usually a financial settlement. That's, I think, the pivotal point of the whole Washington Principles, is that just and fair wording there. That allows us to do our quiet research and our quiet resolution of historic claims.
Maybe we can also talk a little bit about some of the situations, and some of the language around those situations. So, for instance, people often associate questions of restitution with looting, spoliation, other terms like forced sales, and perhaps more complicated, the whole idea of flight assets. Can we talk a little bit about those various situations?
This is a good case in point. I mean, if one had to describe the very broad narrative arc in a few minutes, I would say that if you noted the title of the Washington Conference, it was the title was Confiscated Art. So the thinking at the end of the 1990s was all about dramatic confiscations down the barrel of a gun on the eve of deportation. Of course, that's the sort of scenario that resulted in the first years of the sorts of work that we in our team do and other provenance researchers around the world do. But I would say, broadly speaking, what we're encountering now, we're now 26 years after the Washington Conference and all the work that museums and the art trade has done or should have done in all those intervening years. We're seeing much more nuanced cases, and you talk about flight asset sales, duress sales, and that's something we're seeing more and more of. We're having to sort of redefine the categories, redefine the boundaries of what is a claim and what isn't a claim. And sometimes these are very, very nuanced, complex analyses that we need to make, usually not on our own as a team of researchers and in-house restitution specialists, but usually in dialogue with the victim family itself or their representatives. We have to sort of reach a position through dialogue to decide how these sorts of scenarios should be resolved. I don't know if you can see, the provenance isn't up on screen there, but this is a very wonderful little, as you can see, portrait of a dog called Bob by Manet that Christie sold, I believe, in October, November 2022 from the Getty Family Trust. It's one that we were all particularly fond of, this little portrait of Bob. Generated much love and enthusiasm from our team and the wider company, I'm sure. But when our researchers were doing their quiet due diligence ahead of that lot being published in the Getty catalogue in New York, they found a name which was reasonably concerning to them, which was Estella Katzenellenbogen, a surname I love because it means cat's elbow. And she was a Jewish collector, the ex-wife of a male collector called Ludwig. She was a Jewish collector who fled Nazi Germany from her hometown in Berlin to California in the late 30s, before the Second World War. And she managed to take that little portrait of Bob with her. So probably having looked at that sort of narrative 10 years ago, we wouldn't have seen a problem. She was Jewish, yes, but she left Nazi Germany, managed to take the painting with her. And our researchers managed to establish beyond doubt that she still had that painting with her in California until March 1945. They couldn't show that she still had it until the end of hostilities, at least in the European theatre of war. And the Katzenelnbogeners, through their New York attorney, argued that because we hadn't been able to show that she retained that painting until the end of the Second World War, because she'd had to flee Germany as a Jew for her life, taking some artworks with her, which she then sold gradually to survive on, and that one couldn't be shown to have been sold only after the Second World War, that the causality of her sale was that she was a Jew who had fled for her life from Germany. So a small settlement, I don't know the exact percentage, but a settlement was put in place, ensuring that good title could pass from the Getty family, essentially through Christie's, to our unnamed buyer. Without that settlement in place, we wouldn't have been comfortable allowing the work in. But I think I can safely say that maybe 10 years ago, I wouldn't have regarded that sort of narrative as an issue. So sensitivities and perceptions have shifted in my 18 and a half years work in this field very much. And we're encountering an increasing number of these particularly nuanced, complex, our dear boss Mark would call them fact patterns, I think, that we have to then look very carefully at. And that's particularly, bear that narrative in mind. She took the work with her to California, sold it no earlier than March 45. The reshaping of our thinking on this sort of nuanced, complicated narrative is very much recalibrated following what happened with the next slide, I believe. Shall I carry on and talk a little bit about this one? This was I told you I did German expressionist art history at the Courtauld, so this sort of thing is very much what I love. As you can see, it's foxes by one of my favorite artists called Franz Marc, who very sadly died in the First World War. But as we watched from the outside developments in Germany towards the eventual restitution of this painting, we realized if it was given back to a set of heirs called the Gravi family, Grawi, everything that we did and would have to be looked at in a fresh light. So that painting was in the Kunstpalast in Düsseldorf, a very important museum. And for many years, that museum and the city in which it finds itself had resisted restitution. And I think for me, looking at the case from the outside, I wasn't part of the legal team claiming it and not one of the family. It came as a tremendous, I think, surprise that it was given back. The reason for that is the owners, the Gravi family, were Jewish, and they again had to flee for their lives from Nazi Germany, which they managed to do. But the key surprise to me and the key recalibrating factor in all of this was that painting was sold in 1940, not in Nazi Germany or indeed any other Nazified country in Europe. It was sold in New York. So Kurt, the husband, had fled. His wife and her two sons by a previous marriage followed on. But the event of the sale of that painting, which then gave them money to survive on in their new lives abroad, happened not in Nazi Germany or Nazi Europe, but in New York. Not far away from here, where we've just come from. So that, you can imagine, reshifts all our thinking, because it's all about causality. Why did Kurt and Elsa Gravi sell this painting? They sold it because they needed funds to survive on, being refugees from Nazi Europe. So that makes us then, and that decision happened at the end of 2021, we had well, not me, I wasn't there then, but Eileen and her team had the great good fortune to offer it for sale at Christie's in London, where I work. But as you can imagine, that's, again, had the effect of recalibrating all of our thinking. Because now, even more than ever, we have to be very conscious of cause. Why did a Jewish family sell? It could appear to be entirely free of issue. If pretty much all of you in the room, I imagine, if you heard a sale had happened in New York, you'd probably think there wouldn't be an issue. But there is, because of the cause of that sale. So that was the key lesson learned with that painting.
I think the Grawie story, too, is something that was so particularly meaningful to me. If I can, I'll share just a little bit more about the Grawies and the story, because it's an important, as much important part of the restitution or a settlement, again, is I think understanding the stories and recording and updating the history. Kurt was a banker and entrepreneur and had been all right, very successful in Germany until the early 30s, and the economic depression hit. He lost a tremendous amount and felt and was under pressure. And then in the rise of the Nazi power, he was increasingly persecuted. His businesses, what were left of them, were Aryanized. In 1938, he was imprisoned for a short time in Sachsenhausen, as many men were. At that time, he was released on the condition, I think, that he left. He did, with 10 Reichsmark in his pocket, and fled to Chile via Belgium. And something that really struck me in preparing the story for this painting, when we were getting ready to put it into the sale, we were writing the essay on it, and we noted that he managed to export the painting. And working with the family, something that was really important to them was to say, that does not give enough color to what the extraordinary circumstances. He smuggled that painting out of Germany. And it's not small. You see, he was able to get it out. And this is, again, it was to save their lives. It was to raise money for the family, to fund their flight from Germany to Chile, where they ended up relocating. And so they really had lost everything. And this painting, which had been the crown jewel of their collection, had to be sold to do so. And as Richard was mentioning, and I think what's so interesting about the flight asset cases, he was able to smuggle it out of the country through a network of dealers and friends and get it to New York. And offer it to a prominent museum, which made an offer which wasn't high enough, that was rejected. Ultimately, before it was sold through a gallery in New York, Nierendorf, to a German movie director, the Dieterles in Los Angeles, who had it then for some time. So it was, again, it was the circumstances, and I think something that resonated with me too were the words of the German Advisory Council that had issued in the mediation that this work should be restituted in full to the family. What was that it was but for the circumstances and the oppression and persecution of the Nazi power at that time, that this painting would not have been sold. And regardless of where it was sold, but for the Nazi persecution that the family suffered, that's why it was sold, and therefore she made the recommendation to return it to the family.
Thank you very much, Eileen. That reminds me of one, well, in a way, that reminds us all perhaps of one thing that we discussed earlier, which is that the work in this field didn't begin out of nowhere. Of course, after the Second World War, some of you may have seen the film The Monuments Men, about the wonderful efforts that the Monuments Men and Women unit made from 1945 until the early 50s. Again, those were works that they were encountering in caches, in caves, in salt mines, in bank vaults that had been looted, had been confiscated. And I said that the reinvigoration of this whole field through the Washington Conference in 1998 talked about confiscation. And what was being addressed in the late 90s, early 2000s, certainly in my early practice in this field, was confiscated art, much more dramatic, clear-cut cases of loss. Now, as we've hopefully explained, we're looking at flight asset sales, forced sales, sales in extremis as Jews fled Nazi Europe. Just imagine if the Grawies or Estella Katzenellenbogen hadn't had those paintings to sell, if they had indeed been confiscated before their flight. Think about how they'd survive without that one asset to sell. So it's worth bearing in mind. So it might be a story of hope, they were able to smuggle these things out or take these things with them out of Nazi Europe. But you have to imagine the in extremis nature of these sales and these movements, and what would have happened to them if they didn't have those few assets remaining to survive on.
A lot of what we've been talking about really points to the changes in attitude that have happened in the last few years. And I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit more to that. Some of what we're showing upstairs in the exhibition is we're comparing two paintings in our collection, and one painting belonged to the family of Maximilian von Goldschmidt Rothschild, and he was forced to sell his entire collection to the city of Frankfurt. And when we talk about a forced sale there, the sale was at a price that was well below the value of the work. And not only that, but he actually did not have access to the account that the funds were put into. In the case of that painting, it was restituted after the war, and since came into our collection. But that is an example of the type of restitution that maybe we'd be talking about more if we had had this conversation 10 or 15 years ago.
I think when I look back on the earlier part of my work in the restitution field, it surprises me now, because I distinctly recall that probably in the mid-2000s, broadly speaking, people tended to regard Jewish collectors and their collections as generally free of forced sales or persecutory measures that would have forced them to liquidate their collections until the passing of the Nuremberg race laws in the third quarter of 1935. Now, any sale by a Jew in any European country that fell under the shadow of Nazism after the 30th of January 1933, when Hitler became Chancellor, is usually regarded as problematic unless one can prove otherwise. So there's been a huge shift in thinking. That's a key point to remember. It's a continually evolving landscape. And before I forget, I also wanted to congratulate you and the museum for being part of that evolution. You've done a wonderful thing in working with the Brombergers to achieve a just and fair solution, and done a wonderful thing in telling the story as part of your exhibition and this event. But also, you did it, I believe, because you wanted to give an example to other US museums to do more work in this field. So I think that's a tremendously good example. I wanted to say that before I forget.
I echo your sentiments completely. And in parallels, often our answers are a little bit different. I think what's also interesting to think about, how did we get to where we are now, is to acknowledge the tremendous strides that have been made in the field of provenance research. And I think the Washington principles set forward the policy that made our department where we are possible, as well as the American Association of Museums and other. I mean, there's been a lot of tremendous and great movement in that respect. But at the late 90s, there was a change. The Cold War ended. It's the advent of the internet. Archives started to become open, and the field of provenance research itself blossomed. And I'm very humbled to work with the incredible team that I do, and to echo again sentiments that you've shared too. Uncovering these stories, our provenance researchers know the archives to go to, have access to the scholars and the records, and are incredible at piecing together and contextualizing and creating the story around these objects, around their movements. And the field of restitution, I don't think, would be where it is now without knowing the stories, without the research. And the research is the result of the provenance researchers who are so passionate and dedicated and capable in doing that. And there's been tremendous growth in the field of provenance research with the evolution of university programs and others, where people now can not just learn on the job, but have academic training in the field, which is so incredibly valuable to what we do.
I would say as a final concluding point there that we've seen a vast upswing of interest from young art history graduates, some lawyers who want to work in our field. When I began, and when we began, it was probably a much more niche thing, but so many recent art history graduates, some lawyers want to become provenance researchers. So it's wonderfully encouraging. Along with the work you've done and your museum has done, it's wonderfully encouraging to see so many young people wanting to get into our field. So I have, the hope perhaps is delimited by national attitudes to restitution and provenance research, but broadly speaking, I think we are going gradually in the right direction. There's so much education in this field, there's so much passion for it, so much interest in it. I think it's work that will need to continue for many decades to come, but it's certainly not short of young people, young scholars very keen to move into this enriching, rich field.
Thank you both so very much.
Can we have a round of applause for our speakers?